Hi everyone, welcome to History on Trial. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We are going to be talking about Indian slave ships. Yes, Indian slave ships. And the possibility that these slave ships were used to replace the First Nations. Now it's possible that these Indian slave ships were named this way because perhaps the Indians actually owned the slave ships. That's one possibility. This could have been done to commemorate the Indians. That's another possibility. This could have been an objectifying of Indians. And then there's also the possibility that there were Indians on the slave ships because they were enslaved. We're going to start off with the Indian king ships. Okay, before we start looking at the Indian king ships, let's just make note of one fact, and that is that these voyages were taking place primarily in the 1700s, and they were going on during the time of the battles for succession that were going on in Europe and that were going on in Africa, and to a certain extent also going on in the Americas. Let's look at these 4 Indian king ships here. It's important to note that sometimes you'll have one ship that's making multiple voyages, and that may be the case in a number of situations, particularly when you see that a ship has a particular name and it has the same captain over and over, and you also see the same owner. And so, but for this instance, we have 4 voyages with an Indian king ship. And you have one coming out of Bristol, one coming out of London, and one coming out of Liverpool. Not only did these human traffickers have Indian king ships, they also had ships identified as the Indian Prince. And so we're going to look at some of those ships. And here is a list of the Indian Prince slave voyages. Now you can see in a number of instances you have the same captain over and over. When you look to the right, you see John Watkins, and you see John Watkins making several journeys there. And so you see 1751, 1753, 1754, 1755. He was extremely busy. And so you see some of these names repeated year after year. And so you see multiple voyages with this Indian Prince name coming out of Bristol and then going through different ports in Africa and then ending up in the Caribbean for the most part there. And these are all going on during the 1700s. Now what's also interesting is that they are not giving upfront information about the slaves arriving, the enslaved people arriving at the first port. What is noteworthy about all of this, of course, is that this is supposed to be the transatlantic slave trade involving bringing people from the continent of Africa into the Americas. And so a question that should pop up is, why is a slave ship named the Indian Prince and also the Indian King? And you will see that there are multiple voyages with this name. And here you have additional voyages with the Indian Prince, again coming out of Bristol primarily, but also coming out of London. And this again is during the 1700s. Now let's talk about the Indian Queen ships. One thing you can see here is that there were multiple voyages with the Indian Queen ships, and these ships again coming out of Bristol, going through Africa, and then landing in the Americas. Now for these, the Indian Queen ships, you'll notice that you see mainland America identified multiple times. So you see Charleston, you see York River, you see Virginia, in addition to Jamaica and Barbados and St. Kitts. So one thing that's also noteworthy is that this was all taking place during the time of the battles for succession. You also see on the right-hand side the ship captains presenting multiple times, and so it looks like this may have been the same ship making multiple voyages in a number of instances. And so this is really important to take note of with this naming dynamic that's going on, again, because you're talking about a transatlantic slave trade that's supposed to involve Africans coming to the Americas, but here you have very clearly identified the Indian Queen and the Indian King, the Indian Prince. What's noteworthy also is the issue of Indians. You had two groups of Indians that were involved at this time, because you had Indians from India who were actually in England at this time, and the data related to these Indians, it was in aggregate with respect to those who were identified as Indian and those who were identified as African. And so these groups were together in terms of the way the histories were presented. And so this is interesting because you had the same dynamic in the Americas, where you had the histories of these two groups of people presented often in aggregate. And so it's very interesting, and it makes it very muddy in terms of understanding exactly what was going on and who this Indian Queen was supposed to represent. Are we talking about East Indians? Are we talking about West Indians? Are we talking about mainland Indians? And yes, the Indian Queen voyages go on. So this is a pretty long list here. And you can see that they are primarily coming out of Liverpool, Bristol, London, yet again, going into Africa, and then making their way into the Caribbean. And you can see again that these are taking place during that time of the battles for succession. And you can also see that the captains, you see some repetitive captains there, suggesting that in some instances we're talking about one ship and multiple voyages. And there were 3 ships that were traveling with just the name Indian. And these were primarily coming out of Liverpool, making their way into the Caribbean, one in 1729, 1799, and 1800. Okay, so we were just looking at the transatlantic slave ships. Now these are some ships that were the trans-American slave ships, and interestingly, these ships also were named with Indian. What's interesting about these ships, even though you have an Indian King and an Indian Queen, is you have a ship specifically called West Indian, and then you have another ship called Indians. That's the name of the ship, Indians. And you can see the number of enslaved people off to the right for these particular voyages. Now let's talk about what appears to have gone on during this time frame. It looks like there might have been some replacement migration going on, some replacement demography dynamics going on, where you have a colonizer group or groups of colonizers, because you did have groups of colonizers. And it appears that these groups of colonizers were doing the same thing on the African coast that they were doing on the American coast. It looks like they were landing and then ethnically cleansing the original people groups. So they appear to have been removing parts of the original groups and then replacing the original group members with settlers. They would call them settlers, but they were just instruments of colonization. And so they would put those people there in place of the original people. And they would either become the original people, what's known as they would go native, or they would integrate with them. And this was going on at a monumental scale in both Africa and in the Americas. And so you don't really see this clear line of demarcation between the original inhabitants and the colonizing groups. And so one way to do this most efficiently would be to remove the male members of the original groups and replace the male members with colonizing males and have them marry into the families of the original groups. Now, this was definitely going on in Africa, where you had matrilineal descent. Also going on in the Americas, where you have matrilineal descent. And what often took place was that the colonizers would marry into the what would be considered the royal groups. They would marry the royal women, the princess of a particular nation, and then take on the privilege and power that comes along with marrying into that particular group. And this was going on in Africa, and it was also going on in the Americas. And so that might also explain why there needed to be all of these ships and voyages containing Indians. There was a high probability that they contained Indians. Another thing that's pretty noteworthy is the removal dynamic that was going on. There were removals going on in Europe, and when those individuals were removed and deported, some of them participated in the removal of the original inhabitants of the Americas. They also participated in this over in Africa. And so they had been removed. They had been sort of sold out by their chiefs. And this was in the Scottish Highlands. They had been sold out. And so when some of them came to the Americas, they participated in the same dynamic, tit for tat. And so what they went through, some of them participated in putting the original inhabitants of the new lands through the same thing that they went through. And so instead of standing their ground where they came from, they came into Africa and into the Americas and did basically the same thing that was done to them. And so instead of compassion, there was sort of an identification with the oppressor or the aggressor. And just as a reminder about what colonization is all about, it's basically where a country sends settlers to a particular place so that they can establish control over that place. And so they send people to migrate there. And often what happens is that the home country is made uncomfortable for the people so that they will have motivation to leave. Otherwise, they wouldn't leave if they were perfectly happy where they were. So they make it very uncomfortable for them where they are, and then facilitate that deportation immigration process into another land that country wants to take over, that country wants to colonize, and they send their people in order to facilitate the colonization process. Now, the people may not be going with that in mind. They may be going thinking they are just going to better themselves in a new land. But you send a mass of people when you are a country that is colonizing. And so they become invasive. And so that's what happened in Africa with Europeans going into Africa because they were deported. And then you had the same thing with the Americas. And so you had different European countries sending in masses of people to colonize. They would call it settling. It's called stealing land is what it is. So that's what they were doing in both places. They were sort of invading both places in order to establish political control. And so you see here there is talk of resettling people in a particular place in order to establish that colony. It's basically an occupation. Early in the morning. Early in the morning. Okay, so as we are wrapping this up, some things to keep in mind related to these odd slave ships with these Indian names is that there is a high likelihood that they were used to remove First Nations. They may have removed entire nations and transplanted them in other places. And so that is definitely something to keep in mind with respect to this idea that Indian nations were disappearing. You know, they will say they went extinct. And so there's an assumption that they went extinct because of war, but they may have gone extinct. Certain groups may have gone extinct because they were literally removed and placed in other places. They were placed in exile. And because they are using king, queen, and prince, there is a suggestion that these were exile ships, perhaps, and they were exiling nations. And so you also see this partial replacement of First Nations with other groups of people, primarily from Europe, but not only Europe. They were bringing other groups of people over also in order to mix and mingle and completely confuse identities and changing names and doing all sorts of interesting things. One interesting thing that they were doing was it appears that they were taking on, some of these groups were taking on Indian identity way past the point of the initial contacts and creating Indian groups. And so that's something to be mindful of, because sometimes what people are seeing is colonization and ethnic cleansing, and then basically stealing the identities of the First Nations and pretty much wearing the garment of those people. And so supplanting, if you will, you had some supplanting going on. And this supplanting involved some of the Moriscos and Marranos, in addition to some other groups. And so that's part of the reason why you see some of these artifacts, you see some of the practices, you see some of the naming. People are often assuming that this is the original name of something in the Americas when they see it, versus this is something that was put on this space. It would be like if you went somewhere to another country and you left some artifacts from your home there and they were discovered later, and then people assume because they found these things in this particular place that this is the original place for these artifacts. And so this is a dynamic that was definitely going on. You can see this with the naming of things. You can see it with cultural artifacts. You can see it with clothing. You can even see it in the phenotype and also in the DNA. As we wrap up, it's important to remember that throughout history, people have been moving around, people have been moved around, shoved out, deported, immigrated, and sometimes that has resulted in those individuals taking on spaces that were not originally theirs, and also sometimes taking on the identity of the people that they replaced. And that may definitely be the case in terms of what happened with these Indian ships. It definitely does appear that Indians were the ones who were being moved and removed during what was supposed to be the transatlantic slave trade, involving bringing African people into the Americas. And so it looks like there was some sort of movement with American Indians. Now, some might say the American Indians were being moved around throughout the Americas, but it looks like there was a little bit more involved than just a trans-American slave trade dynamic going on, because you have Bristol, Liverpool, London, and then different parts of Africa involved in this whole process. And also remember that sometimes the slave voyages involved the rebels, the prisoners, coming out of Europe and apparently being taken to Africa on what later became slave ships. And so it's also important to remember that just because you find a people in a particular place, it doesn't mean that that's where those people are rooted. It doesn't mean that that's where they sprang up from. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.